This is controversial, but it's time to talk about Donald Trump's first year as president in 2025. Many asked, was this a political revolution or a constitutional crisis in disguise? Today, we're breaking down how the first year of Trump's presidency tested America's most sacred safeguard, the system of checks and balances. 112 executive orders in 24 hours. Elon Musk in the White House, and the Schedule F executive order, Laken-Riley Act, trade wars, Kuala Lumpur agreement with China, Canada as the 51st state, radical protectionism, and an almost complete break with NATO, capture of Venezuela's president, possible takeover of Greenland, promise to end the war in Ukraine in 3 days, bringing Putin out of international isolation, Project 2025. President Trump has spent his first year in office treating Joe Biden's presidency as a historical aberration, not just undoing his policies, but casting his entire term as illegitimate. How was this possible without a single act of Congress? Welcome to Trump's 365 days in numbers, decrees, and implications for America. Speed became the weapon. Let me give you a number that explains everything that followed. 112. That's how many executive orders Donald Trump signed in his first 24 hours back in office. For context, Joe Biden signed 17 executive orders in his entire first week. Trump himself in 2017 signed 5 on his first day. This was not improvisation. This was not the chaos of 2017 when Steve Bannon and Reince Priebus fought over whose memo reached the president's desk first. This was a military operation. Every order was pre-written. Every signature was choreographed. Every consequence was calculated. The strategy had a name in political science circles: system overload. Here's how it works. In the American system, the primary check on executive overreach is the judiciary. A president signs an order, someone sues, a judge issues an injunction, the order is frozen while courts deliberate. This worked reasonably well for most of American history. But what happens when you sign 100 orders at once? The courts can't process that volume. Lawyers can't file that many suits simultaneously. By the time a judge blocks one order, 3 more have already taken effect. By the time an appeals court hears arguments, the facts on the ground have changed. The employees have been fired. The funds have been frozen. The regulations have been gutted. Executive Order 14170, titled Regulatory Relief, imposed an immediate moratorium on all new federal regulations. Not a review, not a pause for consideration. A complete halt. Agencies that had spent years developing environmental standards, labor protections, financial oversight, all of it frozen mid-sentence. And here's the part that surprised even veteran observers. The markets loved it. The S&P 500 broke records in the first 6 months of 2025. Deregulation plus the extension of the 2017 tax cuts created what traders called the sugar high. Corporate earnings projections soared. Stock buybacks accelerated. This market euphoria accomplished something no amount of political rhetoric could. It paralyzed business criticism. CEOs who might have raised concerns about democratic norms looked at their stock prices, looked at their bonus calculations, and stayed silent. The business community, which had been a moderating force in American politics for decades, was effectively bought off. Not through corruption, through alignment of incentives. The Democrats, meanwhile, were caught flat-footed. They had prepared for a political fight. They got a bureaucratic blitzkrieg. By the time they organized a coherent response, the battlefield had already shifted. Block 2, the operating system rewrite. If the executive order blitz was the shock, what followed was the fundamental restructuring of how the American government operates. To understand what happened next, you need to understand a piece of paper called Schedule F. Since 1883, the American federal workforce has operated under a civil service system designed to be nonpartisan. Career employees, the scientists, lawyers, economists, and analysts who actually run the government, were protected from political interference. You couldn't fire them for being Democrats or Republicans. You couldn't fire them for refusing to implement illegal orders. They had due process rights, appeals, protections. Schedule F ended that. Executive Order 14171, signed within hours of the inauguration, resurrected and expanded a policy Trump had attempted in the final months of his first term. It created a new employment category called Schedule Policy Career and directed every agency head to identify positions of a policy influencing character. The definition of policy influencing was interpreted maximally. It didn't just mean political appointees. It meant any economist who analyzed the impacts of tax policy, any scientist who published research on climate, any attorney who had ever written a regulation, any analyst who had offered substantive participation in policy formulation. Once reclassified, these employees lost their civil service protections. They became at-will workers. They could be fired without cause, without appeal, without the complex process that had protected federal workers for 140 years. The order included language that was legally elegant and practically devastating. Employees weren't required to pledge political allegiance. They were merely required to faithfully implement administration policies to the best of their ability, and failure to do so was grounds for dismissal. Think about what that means. A career environmental scientist who expressed caution about a new drilling permit, that's failure to implement. An economist who published analysis showing a tariff would raise consumer prices, that's not being a team player. A lawyer who cited precedent that conflicted with a new policy, that's insubordination. The result was predictable. By March 31st, 2025, just 70 days into the administration, Office of Personnel Management data showed the federal workforce had already contracted by over 23,000 positions. By the end of 2025, the administration had announced plans for 300,000 total layoffs, but the numbers don't capture the targeting. Here's where the story takes a distinctly 21st century turn. The administration didn't rely solely on political appointees to identify targets. They brought in Silicon Valley. Elon Musk was appointed to head a, quote, Commission on Government Efficiency. The commission deployed AI software, reportedly from Palantir and Musk's own xAI, to analyze federal employee performance metrics, email communications, and policy outputs. The algorithm identified, quote, ineffective employees. The correlation with certain job categories was striking: DEI officers, climate scientists, civil rights attorneys. At the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, flight directors for the Hurricane Hunter program were fired. Senior forecasters were dismissed. The institutional knowledge accumulated over decades of tracking deadly storms gone in a single round of layoffs. The agencies weren't eliminated. That would require Congress, but they were hollowed out. The buildings remained, the org charts survived, but the people who knew how to actually operate the machinery of government, they were gone. I've studied institutional capture in developing nations. I've analyzed how authoritarian regimes neutralize bureaucratic resistance, but I've never seen it done with algorithmic precision at this scale in a Western democracy. This was something new: the merger of state power and techno-oligarchy, executing a coordinated lobotomy on the administrative state. Block 3, the energy and crypto pivot. The Biden administration's signature economic achievement was the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate investment in American history. $369 billion directed toward electric vehicles, renewable energy, battery manufacturing, clean technology. The Trump administration erased it without repealing a single law. Here's how. The Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse. The president can't simply refuse to spend money Congress has appropriated. That was settled in 1974 with the Impoundment Control Act, passed after Nixon tried exactly that. The Trump administration's position was simple: that law is unconstitutional. On January 20th, 2025, the Unleashing American Energy Executive Order directed agencies to immediately pause the disbursement of funds appropriated under the IRA and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Section 7 of the order was titled, without irony, Terminating the Green New Deal. The Office of Management and Budget issued memoranda freezing grants for EV battery plants, solar farms, and charging infrastructure. Companies that had broken ground on factories based on promised federal grants found themselves mid-construction with no funding. The EPA terminated $20 billion in grants for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, citing misalignment with new administration priorities. States sued. California sued. New York sued. The legal battles will take years to resolve. But in the meantime, the money isn't flowing. The factories aren't being built. The jobs aren't being created. The green energy sector entered what industry analysts called suspended animation. Not dead, but not growing. Frozen in legal limbo while the world moved on without American leadership. Meanwhile, the administration opened a different economic chapter. Drilling permits for wildlife refuges were fast-tracked. LNG export terminals were approved. The EPA, under Administrator Lee Zeldin, proposed repealing the greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles, effectively eliminating the regulatory pressure for automakers to transition to electric vehicles. And then there was the cryptocurrency pivot. The administration announced plans for a strategic Bitcoin reserve, positioning cryptocurrency as a hedge against dollar inflation and implicitly as an alternative to the traditional financial system. Biden's executive order on AI security was repealed, giving data centers, which consume enormous amounts of electricity, complete freedom to expand, often powered by newly permitted natural gas plants. The economic vision was coherent, if you understood it. America as a crypto energy superpower. Fossil fuels powering the data centers that mine digital currency. The green transition abandoned not for lack of technology, but for lack of political will. The startups that had bet on Biden's green subsidies began filing for bankruptcy. The venture capital that had flowed into clean technology redirected toward AI and crypto. Billions in private investment stranded by the stroke of a pen. Block 4, retaliatory justice. If Schedule F was the broadsword used against the bureaucracy, the transformation of the Justice Department was the scalpel. Since Watergate, there has been an informal but iron norm in American politics. The Justice Department operates independently of presidential direction. Presidents don't order prosecutions of their enemies. They don't interfere in ongoing investigations. The wall between the White House and Main Justice is not written in law, but for 50 years it held. In 2025, that wall came down. The first target was predictable: Special Counsel Jack Smith's office. Smith resigned before the inauguration, submitting his final report days before Trump took office. But the administration pursued what can only be described as a scorched earth policy against his staff. In a break with tradition, where career prosecutors typically return to their home districts after a special counsel assignment, the attorneys who served on Smith's team were systematically fired in late January. The administration characterized this as cleansing the department of partisan activists. Then came the security clearance revocations. Attorneys at private law firms who had assisted the investigation found their clearances revoked by executive order, citing national security risks. Without clearances, these lawyers couldn't work on the government-adjacent cases that constitute much of Washington's legal industry. Their careers were effectively over. The message was clear: anyone who participates in investigating this administration will pay a professional price. But the purge was just prologue. The main act was the prosecution of political opponents. In October 2025, a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia indicted New York Attorney General Letitia James on charges of bank fraud. The context matters here. James had successfully sued the Trump Organization for civil fraud in New York, securing a massive financial judgment. She was, by any measure, one of Trump's most prominent legal adversaries. The federal charge? A technical irregularity in a mortgage application for a property in Virginia. Legal scholars called it the Al Capone strategy, finding a technical violation to punish a political enemy when you can't get them on the real offense. Career prosecutors in the Eastern District reportedly refused to bring the case, citing insufficient evidence and the political nature of the charges. The administration's solution: force out the U.S. attorney and install Lindsay Halligan, a former personal attorney for Donald Trump with no federal prosecution experience, as interim U.S. attorney, specifically to oversee the grand jury presentation. A similar pattern followed with former FBI Director James Comey, indicted in September 2025 for allegedly lying to Congress. A federal judge initially dismissed the case due to the irregular appointment of the prosecutor. The Justice Department immediately appealed. Meanwhile, the administration exercised its pardon power liberally for allies. January 6 defendants received pardons. Steve Bannon's charges were dismissed. The contrast created a two-tiered system: aggressive prosecution for opponents, absolute immunity for friends. This isn't unprecedented in world history, it's just unprecedented in American history. Block 5. The geopolitical rupture. For 75 years, American foreign policy rested on a foundation: the transatlantic alliance, NATO, the special relationship, the idea that the democracies of Europe and North America shared not just interests, but values, and that this shared framework justified American security guarantees and European economic partnership. The Biden administration had invested heavily in revitalizing this framework. The Ukraine war became a proving ground for alliance solidarity. European defense spending increased. NATO expanded. The West seemed united. The Trump administration viewed this alliance structure differently, as a protection racket where America provided security and got taken advantage of economically in return. In April 2025, the administration invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose a universal 10% tariff on all imports, every country, every product. No exemptions for allies. The London School of Economics projected the impact on the EU, a GDP contraction, with the German automotive sector facing particularly severe damage. But the economic impact was secondary to the psychological break. This action signaled that Washington no longer distinguished between allies and adversaries in economic policy. There was no friend shoring. There was only America first. Then came Greenland. In late 2025, President Trump formally renewed his 2019 offer to purchase Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark. He cited the island's strategic importance, its rare earth minerals, its position for the proposed Golden Dome missile defense system. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen declined, calling the offer absurd. The Greenlandic government concurred. The administration interpreted this rejection as an affront. In January 2026, President Trump announced that effective February 1st, a punitive 10% tariff would be levied on all goods from 8 specific European nations: Denmark, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. This was on top of the existing universal tariff. The ultimatum was explicit. If no Greenland deal was reached by June 1st, 2026, the tariffs would rise to 25%. The economic implications were severe. The UK alone faced a projected £15 billion hit to businesses by June. German automotive exports faced potential collapse. Danish shipping was threatened with devastating costs. But the economic damage was, in a sense, the point. The administration was using trade policy as a coercive weapon against a NATO ally to force a territorial concession. The European response was historic. On January 18, 2026, the leaders of the 8 targeted nations issued a joint statement declaring that tariff threats undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. They explicitly rejected the commodification of territorial sovereignty. The EU moved to activate its anti-coercion instrument, a mechanism originally designed to counter Chinese economic bullying. Brussels prepared a retaliatory package targeting 93 billion euros of American exports, designed to inflict maximum political pain on Republican strongholds: bourbon, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, agricultural products from red states. The United Kingdom, despite Brexit, aligned fully with its European neighbors. Prime Minister Keir Starmer called the tariffs completely wrong. The Greenland crisis achieved what decades of French diplomacy had failed to accomplish. It unified Europe in opposition to the United States. NATO still existed, the treaty remained in force, but as a functional alliance, as a body expressing shared strategic purpose, it had become what analysts called a zombie alliance, technically alive, operationally irrelevant. Block 6, the fractured Union. The erasure was not complete. It was resisted. As 2025 progressed, a different story emerged in certain states: California, New York, Illinois, Washington. These blue states refused to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. Governors directed state police to stand down. Some mobilized National Guard units to protect immigrant communities from ICE raids. The administration's response was fiscal. Threats emerged to freeze federal funding for roads, schools, and health care to states that refused compliance. The legal theory was debatable. The Constitution limits conditions on federal grants, but the threat itself was clarifying. America in January 2026 was not a unified nation implementing a coherent policy. It was a fractured territory where federal and state authorities operated in open conflict, where the rule of law meant different things in different places. The social policy erasure was equally stark. An executive order defining sex strictly as male and female based on biology at birth reinstated the military ban on transgender service members. It stripped gender identity from federal regulations, effectively removing Title IX protections. The category of transgender identity was, for federal purposes, erased from the legal lexicon. The Department of Education launched investigations into university endowments, threatening to revoke tax-exempt status for institutions that didn't eliminate DEI programs. Student loan forgiveness programs were terminated. The SAVE repayment plan, the most generous in history, was scrapped, forcing millions of borrowers into less favorable terms. Immigration policy returned to, quote, extreme vetting. In June 2025, a travel ban was imposed on 19 countries, a significant expansion of the 2017 list, effectively halting immigration from large portions of the global South. The verdict. By January 2026, Biden's America had been effectively erased. Its personnel, fired. Its funds, impounded. Its regulations, repealed. Its alliances, fractured. In 12 months, one administration had demonstrated something that political scientists had debated for generations: the sheer power of the American executive when wielded without the traditional constraints of norms, customs, and institutional resistance. The Biden administration had governed within those constraints. It had respected the independence of the Justice Department. It had worked with Congress rather than around it. It had treated career civil servants as partners rather than obstacles. It had nurtured alliances rather than extracting from them. And all of it, 4 years of careful institution building, was undone in one. This is not a story about Trump being good or Trump being bad. It's a story about power, about what happens when an administration arrives with a plan, executes that plan with discipline, and faces an opposition that hasn't understood the rules have changed. The new America that emerged by January 2026 was not the America of the 20th century. It was not a democracy in the traditional sense, not because elections had been canceled, but because the institutional checks that gave elections meaning had been systematically weakened. It was centralized, power concentrated in the executive, the civil service converted from a check into a tool. It was protectionist, the global economy treated as a zero-sum competition, alliances as liabilities to be eliminated. It was efficient, if efficiency is measured by the speed of implementing a vision, regardless of the damage left behind. Whether this represents progress or catastrophe depends entirely on what you believe America should be. That's not my call to make. But here's what I can tell you. After 10 years of studying how power works, what happened between January 2025 and January 2026 was not a change of course. It was a regime change. And regimes, once changed, are very difficult to change back.